Welcome to the Benson Wealth Podcast. I take complex financial and economic topics and make it accessible to the everyday listener. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Benson Wealth Podcast. My name is Drew Benson. I am the president and founder of Benson Wealth Management and a senior wealth advisor with Raymond James. I'm also the co-managing partner for True North Wealth Management Group, which is a platform for independent wealth advisors. I'm a former macroeconomist, and I'm currently a certified financial planner and wealth advisor. So today I had the distinct pleasure of interviewing economist Michael Strain. So Michael holds a PhD in economics from Cornell. He is currently a professor of practice in the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. He is also the director of economic policy studies and senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he holds the Arthur F. Burns Chair. As an economist, his research has largely focused around labor markets, public finance, social policy, and macroeconomics. In addition to his academic writings, he's also been published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the Washington Post, Bloomberg, and the National Review, among others. He's also appeared on MSNBC, CBC, CNBC, and NPR. Lastly, Michael has testified before the United States Congress. So today you're going to hear the second part of my interview with Michael, where we talk about the American dream. Now the question is the American dream dead? That's the narrative, at least. And that narrative is being perpetuated by Donald Trump, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Marco Rubio. It's a bipartisan effort. You're also hearing this from investment pros like Ray Dalio. The general sentiment is that wages have stagnated for decades, that there's no longer social mobility, that you can't get ahead in life anymore, that hard work in America doesn't lead to better outcomes, and that only the elites are actually prospering. There's also this narrative that income inequality is growing rapidly out of control. The question, though, is it true? Well, Michael does some heavy-hitting research in his book, The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It. And what I appreciate about the book is he stays objective, and he just looks at the raw data to help you understand whether this thing called the American dream is still something that you can achieve. Hope you enjoy. While we still have some time left, I've been eager to talk to you about the American dream. There's this persistent narrative that the American dream is dead. In fact, I was thinking about in a prior career before I got into wealth management, I was at my desk and this very lovely colleague of mine was real chatty, and she was saying, I feel bad for your generation because the American dream, there's just no chance anymore for people to get ahead. And I remember inherently rejecting that idea because I grew up in a home where my father provided an amazing lifestyle for us, and we were solidly middle class, and he was a home remodeler. But I've certainly achieved greater income potential than my dad did, and I've experienced nothing but mobility. And I've always inherently felt like the American dream is very much alive and well. But that is not the narrative that you get from most, or I shouldn't say most, but many mainstream politicians, whether it's Elizabeth Warren or Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, investors like Ray Dalio. Like, there's all these voices out there that's telling the American public that the American dream is basically just been squashed and that society's been hollowed out, particularly the middle class. So you have written on the American dream. What say you, Michael, about the American dream? Is it still alive, and is that a thing?
Yeah, I think your characterization is right. First of all, I mean, I do think that that the kind of common narrative you hear from political leaders, and not just from political leaders, but from lots of people who have a voice in the public debate, is that the American dream is, if not dead, in quite bad shape, and at risk of dying in the near future, and that narrative, I think, often expresses itself in empirical statements. Like wages and incomes have been stagnant for decades. The younger generation has it worse than the previous generation. Yep. Hard work doesn't pay off. All the gains from economic growth are appropriated by the top, 1% or 0.1% or whoever. That America is no longer an upwardly mobile society. And these are these are empirical propositions that can either be verified or refuted. And I think what's remarkable about this is that kind of point by point, these empirical statements about the health of the American dream, I think are just at odds with the facts.
Right.
And I think that the 2008 financial crisis was such a traumatic event, and I think it took so long for the economy to get back on its feet, and I think it took so long for kind of typical workers and typical households to get back on their feet. That this narrative took hold, and here we are, a long time after 2008, and I think this is still the dominant narrative. But I think, like, just because something was true in 2010 doesn't mean that it's true in 2024, and doesn't mean that it was true in 1994. And so you're very kind to mention my book, and what I kind of do in the book is I just take a look at these basically empirical statements. Is it the case that wages for typical workers have been stagnant for decades? I think that's like a clearly false statement.
It is a false statement, and you made it undeniably clear. And I want to compliment you because it was very objectively written. You didn't come in with an axe to grind. It didn't feel like you were trying to necessarily prove a very specific point, despite the data being against it. It was like, hey man, here's the data. Take it or leave it. And the wage data, which we keep being told that wages have stagnated forever, you just point out very clearly in your book, and I would encourage listeners to go buy it and read it. That's just not the case. Like, wages have indeed increased. Do you want to elaborate at all about any of those data points on that?
Well, and by a lot, and so I think I mentioned the financial crisis as I think maybe the root source of all this pessimism. It's also the case that the 70s, which you alluded to a minute ago when we were talking about the Fed, into the 1980s were a tough period for workers because of all the inflation that we had. We had nominal wage growth, but prices we had price inflation that was really kind of out of control. And so the economy was not in a great macroeconomic place in the 70s. That continued into the 80s. But in the kind of early 90s, we had beat inflation. We had some technological innovation. We had a balanced budget. We had a solid approach to fiscal policy, and the economy turned a corner. And if you look at the last 3.5 decades, you see that after adjusting for inflation, wages for typical workers have increased by more than 40%. That's a huge increase in the purchasing power of an hour's work for typical workers, and that occurred despite 9/11. It occurred despite the 2008 financial crisis. It occurred despite the slow recovery from the financial crisis. It occurred despite the COVID-19 pandemic. It occurred despite the inflation that we've had since the COVID-19 pandemic. But so it's not a story of uninterrupted progress. Wages were stagnant from 2008 until 2014 or so. Those were hard years, but even
that's one time frame with a clear major shock to the macro system, right? It's like there's a story there, but this narrative that there's this long secular period of zero wage growth is just factually not true. The other thing that I think people forget, and you talk about this in your book a bit, is like underlying living standards, whether or not wage growth increases, has also materially changed in aggregate, right? Prices have gone up for all goods in aggregate, but not every single good.
Sure.
Like, for instance, I remember when my parents bought a computer in 1995. I distinctly remember my dad bringing it home. It had the power of 1/100th of the power of my smartphone next to me, and that thing was $2,000. I remember when they bought a flat screen TV in 2000. That cost $2,000. I've got a flat screen TV on my wall right next to me. I bought it for $350, I think, and it's like twice the size. I just bought a new iPad the other day because my other one broke and shattered. $350 for something that historically has actually cost a whole lot more. And even much of the smartphones out there, we don't see aggressive price increases on it the way you would see on certain goods. So some of those goods that have provided some substantial comfort, if you will, have actually come down in price. And I think that's also a nuance to this discussion that's utterly ignored. You also point out in your book, I know you didn't phrase it that way in your book, but one of the other points that you make is there's also different ways in which we make compensation. So people just look at their peer comp without looking at benefits. Do you want to touch on that as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we were talking about wages, but wages are the most important kind of component of income, of the flow of resources that households can use for savings or spending. But income also includes benefits. Income includes transfer payments you receive from the government, and at this point, the kind of median household gets more from the government than it pays in taxes. So most households are getting more than they're paying in taxes, and when you look at the income growth of typical households, of the median household, that's gone up even faster than wage growth. Income is just kind of one component of your quality of life, and when you think about quality of life more broadly defined, people used to have surgery for ulcers all the time. Now people take a pill. People used to die of heart attacks all the time. The mortality rate from cardiovascular disease has plummeted. And so if you just kind of look at broader quality of life, we are living much better than our parents did when our parents were the same age we are. And that is not the impression you would get from listening to politicians on both sides of the aisle.
I totally agree. Okay, so a final question for you, because I know we're starting to bump up against time. People say, well, that's great, Michael. Like, sure, in aggregate, maybe wage growth is up, but it's isolated to sort of the elite of society. So, there's this very broad narrative, another false one in my opinion, but that there's massive wealth inequalities and there's no social mobility. So yes, certain people are enjoying great living standards today, but not everyone. In fact, a lot of people's living standards are materially worse. That stabs at is there mobility in society, and your book touches on that. What do you say about the mobility piece? Can people actually acquire a better living standard, or are they stuck in sort of their social class?
Yeah, so I think I agree with you that's how people talk about mobility. The wage statistics I referred to for typical workers, precisely defined as the average wage among the bottom 80% of workers, and so that's that those statistics exclude the top roughly the top 20%. The household income statistics I provided are for the median household. If you look at the 20th percentile household, the household where 80% of households earn more and 20% earn less, there you see even faster post-tax and transfer income growth, if you look at whether the gains from economic growth really go to the top. I mean, think about the last few years, just as an example. We've had this inflation, for the kind of average worker, prices have grown faster than wages since President Biden took office. But for low wage workers, lower wage workers are the only group that have consistently seen their wages outpace inflation. And so if you kind of look at folks who went to college, they've fallen behind in terms of their inflation adjusted incomes. If you look at folks that stopped their education at high school, or if you look at folks that are earning in the bottom 20% of the wage distribution, they're the ones who've seen actual inflation adjusted wage growth during this entire post pandemic period. And then if that's because they're more sensitive to the business cycle, and so we've had this extremely hot economy over the last 3 years, and in fact, most of the benefits of a hot economy go to the bottom, not to the top, and at least in terms of wages. And if you kind of look at if you look at upward mobility across generations, there are a lot of ways to measure that, but something I do in the book is just ask a very simple, question. Let's take people who are, kind of roughly, in their 40s today, and see if they have a higher household income than the household they were raised in when their parents were the same age that they are now. And it turns out that about 3/4 of people do. About 3/4 of adults in their 40s today have a higher household income than their parents had when their parents were in their 40s. If you look at people who grew up in the bottom 20%, about 9 out of 10 of those people have a higher income today than their parents had when their parents were the same age. And so, we should want these to all be 100%. We should want everybody to go on to have a higher income than their parents had. We shouldn't be complacent. We shouldn't be satisfied. But if
those are good numbers, though.
Those are good numbers.
Those are darn good numbers. Come on,
they're good numbers.
You can't have perfection.
You can't have, or at least you shouldn't expect it. And if 3/4 of people are earning more than their parents earned, and if that share is even higher for the bottom 20%, I think the right diagnosis is that America is an upwardly mobile society, not that America is no longer upwardly mobile. But we should keep fighting for 100%.
Agreed. One final quick note is when I've read about income inequality, one of my big beefs is that the way they measure it is they just look at the categories of people with the assumption that people don't travel between them. Uh-huh. And so they're not looking at the flesh and blood. This is a point that Thomas Sowell has made when he's written on this in articles over the years. It's like if you actually track individuals and how they move through the brackets, use the 5 sort of categories, if you track the individuals, the flesh and blood, it completely destroys the statistical narrative that's created by the Thomas Pikettys of the world that are claiming there's massive inequalities. And I just think that's lazy statistics. And what I appreciated about your book, and I want to plug for a listener, is you're way more nuanced and complex in the way you're analyzing the statistics than I would say many of other economists. The way in which they study it, you're just way more complex on it, and I appreciate and commend you on that, because I think statistics can be very deceptive, but you did a good job of teasing out the underlying narrative to those numbers. And how do you feel about that statement?
Well, I appreciate it, and it's what I try to do, and I think it's what authors owe their readers is the truth.
Exactly. Michael, thank you so much for your time today. It was a pleasure.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. It was great to be with you.
If you've enjoyed this content and you're looking for a wealth advisor, or if you're a financial advisor and you're looking to make the jump to the independent side, please message me on LinkedIn, or you can email me at drew.benson@bensonwealthmgt.com. Or lastly, you can call my office at 603-316-2544. Securities offered through Raymond James Financial Services, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services are offered through Raymond James Financial Services Advisors, Inc. Benson Wealth Management and True North Wealth Management Group are not registered broker-dealers, and they are independent of Raymond James Financial Services. The foregoing information has been obtained from sources considered to be reliable. We do not guarantee that it is accurate or complete. It is not a statement of all available data necessary for making an investment decision, and it does not constitute a recommendation. Any opinions are those of myself and not necessarily those of Raymond James. Expressions of opinion are as of this date and are subject to change without notice. There is no guarantee that these statements, opinions, or forecasts provided herein will prove to be correct. Investing involves risks, and you may incur a profit or loss regardless of strategy selected.